Good afternoon, or good morning rather. Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It's our pleasure and our honor today to have Representative Sandy Levin of Michigan's 9th Congressional District with us. He's here to talk about the broad range of U.S. trade policy initiatives that the Obama administration has begun or has started, and speaks from a position of authority, both substantive and political, as the ranking member of the House Ways and Means Committee, which of course has jurisdiction over trade as well as all tax and economic growth policies in the House. This is, we were just talking about this, I believe the fourth time Congressman Levin has consented to come to the Institute. And as we say with a few select friends, it takes a lot to get an invite back. And so for the fourth time, it is for us a particular thrill to have someone who is not averse to controversy, not averse to his principles being stated, and not averse to being challenged by our audience. And we look forward to a very active Q&A session after the Congressman's remarks. Just for those of you who are not aware, Representative Levin has been serving in the House since 1982. Prior to coming to the House and getting elected, he actually served a 4-year assignment as an assistant administrator for USAID, so he comes to his international perspectives hard-won, and has a distinguished educational background as well, fit for a guest at a think tank, a BA from the University of Chicago, an MA in International Relations from Columbia, and a law degree from Harvard University. On the issue of trade, he has obviously been a strong spokesman for both his constituency, but also his views of needing standards and effective trade remedy laws for the U.S. in international trade negotiations, something which many of us in this building are not always in line with, but are very glad to debate. And so, in that spirit, I would like to invite the Congressman. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you for all of you coming. As you mentioned, I've been here before. I look forward to coming here, and my best to Fred, because this has been a place where there is meaningful discussion and debate about trade policies and differences about them. I like to come here because there's an effort to dig beneath the surface, and sometimes that leads to controversy. But I think, especially in trade policy, having some controversy can lead eventually to constructive solutions. So I have prepared, as I have now for the fourth time, some written remarks, engaged in them personally, and then I'd like very much to have some back and forth. So let me, if I might, review my remarks, and then we'll have some back and forth. We scheduled this before lunch to save money for the Institute, but we can go, if you get too hungry, you can raise your hand and I guess leave. There will be no lunch. We have a lot to talk about today. The administration is engaged in negotiations that go far beyond our nation's vast expanses, Atlantic and Pacific, as well as our northern and southern borders. This demonstrates vividly that globalization is indeed here to stay. Today, Japan joins negotiations to establish a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that would cover 40% of world GDP and about 1/3 of total world trade. Earlier this month, the U.S. and the EU began, as we know, negotiating a Transatlantic agreement that would cover nearly half of world GDP and about 30% of global trade. In Geneva, the U.S. is playing a leadership role in negotiations to establish a trade and services agreement with over 20 nations, with more likely to join in the future. and it is negotiating a customs facilitation agreement and an information technology agreement. This surge of trade negotiation is sparking intensified calls for granting trade promotion authority. On a substantial number of the issues in these negotiations, there's likely to be relatively, I emphasize relatively, easy, broad-based bipartisan agreement. There continues to be a strong international current with roots going back many decades among Democrats, and a pro-trade orientation embraced by Republicans, despite some occasional strong nationalist echoes. As economic globalization mushroomed, there were several sources of growing differences. Sometimes they involved a clash of different, quite specific interests. But as I look back, increasingly they reflected a broader dynamic. The approach to international economic issues increasingly reflected approaches to domestic economic issues. While there was a common belief in the vital role of the operation of free market forces, there were differences of magnitude as to how much markets should be left alone or regulated. For those who believe domestically less is better, we have seen a strong tendency to describe expanded international trade as invariably win-win. Supporters of this approach were less prone to support strong enforcement, such as anti-dumping rules, believing instead that distortions in markets were best left alone to work themselves out. On the other hand, for those more inclined to consider steps to shape market operations domestically, they were more inclined to address steps against market distortions in the international sector. Supporters of this approach have taken the lead in trying to shift the equation that has dominated discussions of trade as free trade versus protectionism to one of free trade versus free and fair trade. While not the only factor, these different perspectives clearly affected what approach in the 80s to take towards Japanese mercantilism and the dramatic increase in the exports of its manufacturing products shipped from its closed markets to the completely open American one, whether to have a hands-on or a hands-off reaction. There never was a clear, effective governmental program or policy on this issue, one that dominated trade debates for more than a decade, as the American manufacturing sector was badly battered as a result. By the early 90s, the debate over a role for labor and environmental standards displaced trade with Japan on the trade center stage in the U.S. The dispute over NAFTA reflected a globalizing economy, bringing more head-to-head competition between neighboring nations at very different levels of development, with vastly different labor and environmental conditions. While there was a tendency to frame the battle only as a clash between American business and American labor unions, such framing, as I saw it and many others, missed a larger difference over whether market forces in the international marketplace needed to be shaped by building international basic worker and environmental standards into trade agreements. The Clinton administration, which had proceeded without enforceable standards in NAFTA, began to shift to a policy, as President Clinton stated at U of Chicago, to assure that trade, in quotes, lift everybody up, not pull everybody down. There followed an agreement with Jordan that included enforceable international and environmental standards, both labor and environment. Then an agreement with Cambodia to provide more access to the American apparel market as an incentive for adopting international worker rights. The rationale for such standards would have mutual benefit. for the developing nations that needed economic development and their workers, who needed a decent wage, and for the U.S., whose workers did not want to compete with those unable to raise their own wages, and whose American companies needed a growing middle class in other nations to buy their products. The battle over the role of labor and environmental standards intensified during the Bush administration, which rejected the insertion of enforceable worker and environmental standards in trade agreements, substituting in them simply that nations must enforce their own laws, whatever they were. One argument often offered in support of that approach was that the market would be self-correcting in terms of higher standards as a nation developed. Time after time, for example, despite recommendations from the ITC, the Bush administration refused to use the 421 provision to protect against import surges from China, a provision that was inserted during the politically hard-fought battle of which I was a part of over China PNTR. That repeated refusal seemed hard to explain, except for the doctrine opposed to market interventions. When Democrats gained the majority in the House in 2007, we insisted that trade agreements negotiated by the Bush administration be redone, as embodied in the May 10th agreement that for the first time incorporated fully enforceable labor and environmental obligations in their text, and that addressed how to find a balance in the marketplace between protection of intellectual property rights in medicines and access to them in developing nations. Describing the recent tragedies in Bangladesh, reporters on the ground have written graphic reports on the horrendous conditions in the workplace. Those reports raise vividly the issue whether, as globalization expands, market forces alone will simply correct themselves. A Wall Street Journal editorial suggested this answer. Once countries, and I quote, like Bangladesh can export garments more easily by cutting textile tariffs to zero, they will progress through this stage of industrialization faster. But I believe that events in Bangladesh represent an undeniable challenge to this approach in the design of international trade policy today. And the Obama administration has had a different answer. It has suspended Bangladesh's trade preferences under GSP and paired this with an action plan addressing worker safety and rights that, if acted upon, will result in the reinstatement of GSP to Bangladesh. There is, I think, an emerging a shift in the paradigm. Basic standards are being built in. It is not simply a matter of racing to produce where it is temporarily the cheapest and where labor and environmental standards are their lowest. Impacted by different perspectives, including often those relating to domestic economic issues, I know that there will be no easy answer. But as I see it, Bangladesh raises for the status quo to the need to go beyond, hopefully with goodwill, beyond conventional responses as globalization changes the world of trade. Now a few words about TPP. It provides immense opportunities for and also major challenges to trade policy. There is no question about its importance. With 11, soon to be 12 Pacific Rim countries at the table, TPP, as I said, is expected to cover 40% of world GDP and about 1/3 of total world trade. U.S. dairy producers, for example, see in TPP an opportunity to remove Canadian tariffs in the range of 250 to 300%. as well as non-tariff barriers which have survived 2 previous U.S.-Canada trade agreements. U.S. auto producers see an opportunity to remove Malaysian tariffs of up to 35% and non-tariff measures that significantly raise the cost of importing American cars. And another example, U.S. credit card companies see an opportunity to eliminate a range of barriers to the provision of payment services, from policies promoting domestic monopolies to forced localization. In addition to removing barriers for U.S. exporters, TPP provides an opportunity, in essence, to update NAFTA. As I pointed out in Singapore at the launch of TPP negotiations, Vietnam presents some particular challenges as a long-standing command economy with a poor record on all facets of individual rights. TPP is an opportunity to implement hard-fought improvements in trade policy and to address how to create a level playing field with an economy built substantially on state-owned enterprises. Today, Japan joins the TPP negotiations. I think as we sit, that's happened. The size of its economy presents important opportunities to increase the flow of trade in major fields. It is also urged, and I think that's likely true, that it can provide additional leverage to the Japanese government to implement announced changes named after the Prime Minister, to bring about long overdue structural reforms to open up highly closed markets. The largest closed Japanese market is automotive. Our largest trade deficit after China is with Japan, $76 billion last year. Autos account for 2/3 of that massive and persistent deficit. Japan's economic difficulties in recent decades overshadowed trade issues and made it difficult to address them. But in fact, the auto deficit is larger today than it was in the 1980s, and imports from all countries combined account for a total of just 6% of the Japanese auto market, making Japan the most closed automotive market in the developed world. Having this lock on the 3rd largest auto market in the world has given and continues to give Japanese producers major economies of scale and major advantages to compete in America and all other markets. Consequently, Japan produces today twice as many autos as it consumes, 10 million to 5 million. Because of its size, in addition to other areas like insurance and agriculture, very important ones, Japan automotive issues in TPP present another challenge to trade policymakers. Every administration since the Reagan administration has acknowledged that the Japanese auto market, vehicles and parts, has been rigorously closed. As was indicated to me by one within the Reagan administration many years ago, that administration's strong inclination was to be skeptical of the economic benefits of efforts to intervene in the marketplace, to try to turn one-way trade into two-way trade. Like all subsequent administrations thereafter, all entered into some form of understanding with Japan to open up their automotive structures. But all these partial agreements failed. Unfortunately, I do not believe that the package the administration in April will likely lead to significant two-way automotive trade. Under that package, the fate of U.S. auto tariffs is not tied to reciprocal opening of Japan's market. Instead, it depends on what negotiators negotiate on other product lines. Moreover, The April terms ignore basically the most commercially significant and long-standing non-tariff barriers our exporters have faced in Japan, its history of manipulating its currency. Today, I'm releasing a proposal that would assure a more open Japanese market and a more reciprocal relationship. The proposal has three parts. First, the elimination of the U.S. tariffs should be tied to the opening of the Japanese auto market, not to whatever the tariff phase-out schedule may be for rice in Japan or shrimp in Brunei. We should eliminate the tariffs sooner if Japan opens. We should eliminate the tariffs later if Japan remains closed. Some have suggested this is managed trade. It is not. It is an antidote to address generations of managed trade by Japan. Second, we need an enforceable obligation to avoid manipulating exchange rates. The IMF already prohibits currency manipulation and has done quite a bit to define what actions constitute it. The problem is that the IMF lacks an enforcement mechanism. We need to take the disciplines that have been developed at the IMF, build on them, and subject these disciplines to binding dispute settlement, more or less the same dispute settlement mechanism that applies to other obligations in the agreement. Finally, this proposal addresses not only the long list of current non-tariff barriers in Japan, but also addresses barriers that come up in the future. A tariff snapback does not address the problem adequately. It only means that a country can move from one barrier to the next to avoid the snapback. We need to face forthrightly in trade policies, that two-way trade needs to replace one-way trade. Now a few words about the transatlantic negotiations. They provide a rare opportunity to build on what is already the largest economic relationship in the world, as I said before, accounting for about 2.7 billion in goods and services traded each day. Just as important, an effective transatlantic agreement would help to establish new rules and a new framework for global trade, promoting an equitable and market-based economic model. That model can serve as a viable alternative to the disturbing trend emerging in some countries towards tighter state control over trade flows and larger support for state-owned and state-controlled enterprises, which disadvantages U.S. businesses. None of this will be easy. The list of transatlantic trade issues over the years is a long one. Our relationship with Europe is unlike any other. And I spent a little time writing this. The TTIP should build upon the strength of that relationship and should reflect our many common objectives and values, while respecting our differences and being sensitive to those differences, unless they are a cover for narrow special interests standing in the way of an agreement that unites us. Now, a few words about TPA. I support legislation that strengthens the role of Congress in trade negotiations on the front end, through clear negotiating objectives and congressional consultation requirements, in exchange for an expedited up or down vote on a trade agreement on the back end. The purpose is to maximize our nation's role and its leverage in trade negotiations, while preserving the primacy of Congress over trade policy under the Constitution. Two issues will need to be carefully addressed. First, TPA sets the ground rules for engagement between Congress and the administration on trade negotiations. Today, trade agreements address a broad range of policy areas far more than decades ago. Given the importance of the agreements and their potential impact, Congress must play a greater role in their development. That means improving access to negotiating information and putting in place mechanisms to ensure meaningful consultations. Consulting more closely with Congress could help to build broader bipartisan support for trade. There needs to be a more open and a much deeper discussion about the basic perspectives that impact decisions on trade policy. More regularized involvement and consultation perhaps can be an instrument to create more common ground and more action in concert. Members themselves need to talk directly to our negotiators and to each other about these issues. I think probably you won't be surprised what I say next. On vital trade issues, those automatically saying yes or those automatically saying no will not be able to develop a sound trade policy in a rapidly globalizing world. Second, the TPA process allows for the crafting of a broader strategy, as we did in 1988, to tackle the challenges of globalization and to enhance U.S. competitiveness. Since we last considered TPA, the U.S. has experienced the largest trade deficits in our history, contributing to lost jobs and a weak economy. Currency manipulation is a vivid example. The House and Senate have both passed currency legislation. There is strong precedent for pairing TPA with currency legislation. We did so with the very first TPA bill in 1974, and we did it again in the 1988 Act. But many other ideas should be discussed and acted upon. Trade adjustment assistance needs to be renewed, and trade enforcement is critical. We should establish new mechanisms to ensure that customs is enforcing laws against unfairly traded imports. We should codify and strengthen the Interagency Trade Enforcement Center that the President created by executive order. We should consider tax incentives, and we should discuss competitive measures with other committees. For example, in TPA, we should reauthorize the Ex-Im Bank and ensure that it has all the tools it needs to counter more robust export financing programs by countries like China. Business wants that, labor wants that, the Obama administration wants it, and Democrats and Republicans want it too. I close with this recollection. Unfortunately, the TPA debate more than a decade ago was characterized by bitter partisanship that then carried over for years into many subsequent trade debates. We need to avoid choosing up sides, as I said, sometimes automatically, and avoid rushing to completion. If we do it right, the substance can drive us to a consensus that meets the needs of U.S. workers, businesses, farmers, and ranchers, and very vitally recognizes today's realities of globalization. Thank you very, very much, and now let's have some back and forth.